They say at 60, you should be picking out rocking chairs and knitting blankets for grandchildren. But as I stood over a sink of cold, soapy water, my world didn't smell like yarn or cookies. It smelled like copper and rain. Most mothers worry about a missed call. I received a 15-second recording that didn't just break my heart, it turned it into a jagged piece of flint. If you think you know the limits of a mother's fury, you've never met a woman with nothing left to lose but the daughter she spent 3 decades protecting. Before I tell you what I found in that crawl space and how I made the monsters beg for a mercy I didn't possess, hit that subscribe button. Welcome to Vintage Vengeance. Today's story isn't just about survival. It's about the surgical precision of a mother's wrath. Stick around, because by the end of this, you'll understand why you never, ever poke a sleeping lioness. The hum of the refrigerator was the only thing keeping me company in my small kitchen in Savannah. I'm Hattie Mae Pearson. I've spent 60 years minding my business, raising my girl, and working as a surgical head nurse. I know exactly where the major arteries are, and I know how long it takes for a person to realize they're fading. My daughter, Tasha, had finally found her peace. Or so I thought. She'd moved 3 hours away to a secluded cabin near the Altamaha River to finish her dissertation. She wanted quiet. She wanted to be away from the city noise. I was drying a plate when my phone buzzed on the granite counter. It wasn't a call. It was a voice message notification. Tasha never left messages. She was a texter through and through. I pressed play, expecting a complaint about the spotty Wi-Fi or a request for my peach cobbler recipe. Mama, please. The voice was a jagged whisper, barely audible over a rhythmic, wet, thumping sound in the background. My breath hitched. I'm in the cellar. Mama, he found me. He's hurting me. I'm in danger. Please don't let him. The audio cut into a burst of digital screeching. My blood didn't just run cold. It solidified. I called her back. Voicemail. I called again. Nothing. I tried her boyfriend, Terrence. He was the one who suggested the cabin. He was the one who said he'd keep her safe. Terrence, pick up the damn phone. I hissed into his mailbox. I didn't waste time calling the local sheriff. In those woods, the law is a suggestion that takes 40 minutes to arrive. I grabbed my keys and my old medical bag, the one I kept stocked with more than just bandages. The drive was a blur of dark asphalt and towering pines. My mind was a forensic lab, dissecting that recording. The wet thumping, the heat. Tasha was 32, a grown woman, but in that message, she sounded like the 5-year-old girl who used to hide under my bed during thunderstorms. As I turned onto the dirt path leading to the cabin, I didn't see headlights. I didn't see a welcoming porch light. I saw Tasha's car, the driver's side door standing wide open, the interior light casting a sickly yellow glow on the empty seat. I stepped out of my truck, the mud clinging to my sensible shoes. The silence was absolute, save for the wind through the Spanish moss. I reached into my bag and pulled out a heavy, steel flashlight. Tasha? I whispered. No answer. Only the smell of iron and something sweet, like rotting fruit. I walked toward the porch, my heart hammering a rhythm of pure, unadulterated dread. The front door wasn't just open. The hinges were twisted. I stepped inside, the beam of my light cutting through the shadows. The living room was a wreckage of shattered glass and overturned furniture, and there, leading toward the kitchen, were the marks. Long, dark streaks across the floorboards. Something had been dragged. The silence in the kitchen was heavier than the humid Georgia air outside. I stood there, a 60-year-old woman with a flashlight that felt like a baton staring at the floorboards. The investigator in me, the woman who had spent decades seeing the aftermath of human error, knew exactly what those drag marks meant. Something precious had been moved against its will. I followed the trail to the pantry. My hands weren't shaking anymore. They were steady with a cold, surgical resolve. I pushed aside a heavy sack of flour. And there it was, a seam in the wood that didn't quite line up. Tasha! I breathed, my voice barely a thread. I hooked my fingers into the groove and pulled. The wood groaned, protesting as it gave way to reveal a dark, cramped crawl space beneath the kitchen. My light flickered over the interior, and my heart stopped. Tasha was curled into a ball, her clothes torn and soaked with a darkness that wasn't mud. Her face was a landscape of trauma, swollen, bruised, and unrecognizable as the vibrant woman I'd seen just 2 weeks ago. She looked at me, but her eyes were vacant, staring through me into a nightmare I couldn't see. "Mama's here, baby. I've got you," I whispered, reaching down to pull her from the hole. She didn't move. She didn't cry. She was locked inside herself, a survivor of something so heinous the words felt like ash in my mouth. As I lifted her out, her body felt light, like a bird with broken wings. I laid her on the kitchen floor and opened my medical bag. I didn't need a doctor to tell me the extent of the damage. I saw the fractured ribs, the concussion, the signs of a struggle that told me my daughter had fought like hell before she was overcome. But then I saw the mark on her neck, a very specific bruise, the shape of a signet ring I recognized. My blood turned to ice. That ring belonged to Terrence's brother, Malcolm. The betrayal hit me harder than any physical blow. Terrence hadn't just failed to protect her. He had delivered her to a predator. He had suggested this peaceful cabin, knowing his brother was hiding out nearby. This wasn't a random act of violence. It was a setup. I heard a floorboard creak behind me, not the heavy boot of a savior, but the soft, rhythmic step of someone who thought they were alone. "Is she gone yet?" A male voice whispered from the doorway. It was Terrence. He was standing there, holding a shovel, his face twisted into a mask of fake concern that didn't reach his cold eyes. He didn't see me in the shadows of the pantry. He only saw Tasha on the floor. "You've been a busy boy, Terrence," I said, stepping into the light of my flashlight. He jumped, the shovel clattering against the doorframe. "Hattie, what are you doing here?" I just arrived. I found the door open. "Save it," I barked, my voice a roar that shook the small house. "I heard the message. I see the marks. And I see that look on your face, the one that says you're wondering if you can kill a 60-year-old woman before she tells the world what you did." He didn't move toward the phone. He didn't call for help. He stepped closer to me, the shovel gripped tight in his hands. "You should have stayed in Savannah, Hattie," he hissed. "This could have been simple. Now, it's just going to be messy." I didn't reach for a gun. I reached into my bag for a sedative-filled syringe I'd taken from the hospital. In my world, I don't need a trial to find someone guilty. I just need a patient who won't stop screaming. Terrence looked at me like I was a frail old woman who belonged in a church pew, not a dark kitchen smelling of iron and betrayal. He thought his youth and that heavy shovel made him the master of the room. He didn't realize that a woman who has spent 40 years in an operating room doesn't fear the sight of blood. She only fears a sloppy job. "You really think you're going to walk out of here, Hattie?" Terrence sneered, his voice dropping an octave as he moved toward me. "Malcolm is already halfway to the border. By the time anyone finds this place, you'll both be part of the landscape." I didn't blink. My fingers were already hidden behind my back, the plunger of the syringe ready. "You always were a talker, Terrence. Tasha told me you were ambitious. I didn't realize your ambition involved selling her out to your brother's sick urges." He lunged. It was a clumsy, heavy-handed move. He swung the shovel, aiming for my head, but I moved with a speed he didn't expect. I stepped inside his reach. the way I'd seen orderlies handle unruly patients in the psych ward. Before he could pull back, I drove the needle deep into the side of his neck. He let out a sharp yelp, dropping the shovel. His hand flew to his throat, his eyes wide with confusion. What did you? Standard hospital grade, I whispered, watching his pupils dilate. It'll take 30 seconds for your legs to turn to water. Another 60 for your tongue to feel like a lead weight. He tried to swing a fist, but his coordination was already melting. He stumbled back against the kitchen table, the chairs clattering. He looked at Tasha, then back at me, terror finally replacing his arrogance. He collapsed onto the floorboards, right next to the drag marks he'd helped create. I ignored him for a moment, turning back to my daughter. Tasha was still in that catatonic state, her eyes fixed on a point on the ceiling. I checked her pulse, thready but there. I knew the hospital would want to ask questions I wasn't ready to answer. I knew if the law got involved now, Malcolm would vanish into the wind, protected by the same family ties that Terrence used as a leash. I leaned over Terrence, who was twitching on the floor, his breathing shallow. Where is he, Terrence? Where is Malcolm? His jaw worked, but only a gurgle came out. I reached into my bag and pulled out a pair of surgical clamps. I clamped them onto his pinky finger and tightened them until I heard the bone groan. His eyes nearly popped out of his head. The sedative kept him from screaming, but it didn't stop the pain. I can do this all night, I said, my voice as cold as a morgue slab. I know how to keep you conscious while I take you apart piece by piece. Now, tell me where the reunion is. He managed to moan a single word. The swamp house. The old swamp house. It was an abandoned fishing lodge 10 miles deeper into the marsh. It was a place where things went to be forgotten. I stood up and looked at my daughter. I couldn't leave her here, but I couldn't take her with me into the mouth of the beast. I moved her back into the crawl space, padding it with blankets from the bedroom. I left her with a bottle of water and a heavy piece of furniture over the trapdoor. I'll be back for you, Tasha, I promised, kissing her bruised forehead. And when I come back, you won't ever have to be scared of a man again. I walked out to my truck, leaving Terrence bound and gagged in the kitchen with a slow drip sedative in his arm. He wasn't going anywhere, but Malcolm was waiting, and I had a specialized set of tools that didn't involve a badge or a gavel. The drive to the old swamp house felt like descending into a different world. The gravel roads turned to muck, and the Spanish moss hung from the cypress trees like tattered funeral shrouds. I'm 60 years old, and my knees ache when the humidity climbs this high, but as I gripped the steering wheel, I felt a surge of energy that had nothing to do with youth and everything to do with a mother's vengeance. I wasn't just Hattie Mae anymore. I was the reckoning for every tear my daughter had shed in that cellar. I reached the clearing where the lodge sat, a rotting structure perched on stilts above the black, stagnant water. I saw a silver SUV parked out front, Malcolm's car. He was inside, probably celebrating his victory over a defenseless woman. He thought he was a king in these woods. He thought his family's influence and Terrence's silence made him untouchable. I didn't rush in. I parked my truck 100 yards back and approached on foot, moving through the reeds with the silence of a shadow. In my hand, I carried a heavy-duty industrial tranquilizer gun used for large animals, something I borrowed from a vet friend years ago when we had a stray dog problem at the hospital. Through the grimy window of the lodge, I saw him. Malcolm was sitting at a scarred wooden table, cleaning under his fingernails with a pocket knife. He looked just like Terrence, handsome in a way that hid the rot underneath. On the table next to him was a small pile of souvenirs, Tasha's necklace, her watch, and a single earring. The sight of my daughter's jewelry in his filthy hands made my vision tunnel. This wasn't just a crime, it was a collection. He was a serial predator, who had been protected for far too long by people who valued their reputation more than human lives. Malcolm, I whispered to the night air, you're about to find out that some debts can't be settled with a checkbook. I moved to the back porch. The wood was slick with algae. I waited until he stood up to head toward a cooler in the corner. That was my opening. I stepped through the screen door and leveled the tranquilizer at his chest. Don't move, you pathetic coward, I said, my voice steady and cold. Malcolm spun around, reaching for his knife, but he was too slow. I pulled the trigger. The dart hit him square in the shoulder. He let out a grunt of surprise, looking down at the feathered end of the projectile. Who are you? He stammered, his hand reaching for the dart. I'm the woman who's going to make you wish you'd never been born, I said, stepping into the light. I'm Tasha's mother. He tried to lunge at me, his face twisting into a snarl, but the chemicals were already hitting his bloodstream. His legs buckled, and he crashed into the cooler, ice and water spilling across the floor. He tried to crawl, but his limbs were no longer his own. I walked over and kicked the knife away from his reach. I looked down at him as his eyes began to roll back in his head. You and Terrence thought you were so smart, I said, kneeling beside him. You thought you could break my girl and hide her away. But you forgot one thing about women, like me. We don't need a courtroom to know what justice looks like. I grabbed him by the hair and dragged his heavy, limp body toward the center of the room. I had a long night ahead of me, and I had brought enough medical supplies to ensure he felt every single second of it. The old swamp house groaned under the weight of the humidity, the wood rot smell mingling with the sharp, sterile scent of the antiseptic I began to lay out on the table. Malcolm lay sprawled on the floor like a slaughtered hog, his breath coming in ragged, drug-induced hitches. He was a large man, powerful, but stripped of his predatory ego. He was just a collection of meat and bone. I worked with the efficiency of a woman who had spent half her life in a surgical suite. I didn't need a team of nurses. I didn't need a monitor to tell me his vitals. I could see the pulse thrumming in his neck, that same neck that had probably hovered over my daughter while she pleaded for her life. +3. I moved the souvenirs he'd taken from Tasha, the necklace, the watch, the single earring, and placed them on his chest. I wanted them to be the first thing he felt when the secondary stimulant I was about to administer brought him back to a state of hyper-awareness. You think you're a hunter, Malcolm, I whispered, prepping a syringe of adrenaline and a localized numbing agent. But you're just a parasite that mistook a mother's kindness for weakness. I injected the stimulant directly into his thigh. His body jolted, his back arching off the floor as his nervous system fired back to life. His eyes snapped open, darting around the room until they landed on me. He tried to scream, but the paralytic I'd mixed into the initial dart kept his vocal cords as tight as a violin string. Only a low, wet hiss escaped his lips. Don't bother, I said, pulling a pair of heavy-duty industrial zip ties from my bag. The only people who could hear you are the gators, and they don't care much for conversation. I secured his wrists to the heavy legs of the table. I moved with a cold, calculated precision that would have terrified my colleagues back in Savannah. I wasn't just Hattie Mae Pearson, the church-going nurse. I was a forensic specialist of pain. +1. I looked at Tasha's medical records in my head. As I drove here, I told him, picking up a scalpel, she has fractured ribs, a concussion, multiple contusions where you and your brother thought it was fun to use her as a punching bag. +4. I leaned in close, so close he could see the reflection of his own terror in my glasses. I'm not going to kill you, Malcolm. That would be a mercy. And as my daughter told me when she finally found her voice, you deserve to feel exactly what she felt. I began with his hands, the hands that had grabbed her. I didn't cut deep. I just made sure he understood the sensation of being opened up, He thrashed against the ties, his face turning a deep, bruised purple as he tried to pull away. "Your family thinks they can settle everything with a check," I said, referencing the pattern of payoffs Patrick had discovered in other cases. "But how much is a finger worth, Malcolm? How much for the memory of my daughter's face when she thought she was dying in that cellar?" The sound of the wind through the cypress trees was the only witness to the ceremony of justice I was performing. I wasn't interested in a confession. I didn't need a recorded statement for a jury that could be bought or a judge who shared a golf club with his father. I had his phone. I'd already seen the messages between him and Terrence, the planning, the jokes, the pure, unadulterated evil. They hadn't just hurt her, they had enjoyed it. "Phase 1 is nearly over," I said, wiping the blade on a clean cloth. "Now, we're going to talk about your brother, because a setup requires two people, and I have a very special place in my heart for the man who was supposed to love her." Malcolm's eyes pleaded, but there was no room for pity in a house built on Tasha's blood. The old swamp house felt like a tomb, and Malcolm was its first inhabitant. I watched him struggle, his eyes bulging as he realized that no amount of family influence could reach him here in the dark heart of the marsh. My mind drifted back to Tasha, shivering in that crawl space under the kitchen. The memory was a fuel that burned hotter than any anger I had ever felt. "You know, Malcolm," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that cut through his muffled groans. "A mother spends her whole life teaching her child to be kind, to trust, to believe that the world has a spark of light in it. You didn't just hurt her body, you tried to put out that light." I pulled his phone from my pocket. It was unlocked. I scrolled through the messages, the text appearing on the screen like a map of human depravity. There were photos, not just of Tasha, but of other girls, other victims who had likely been silenced by the Henderson family's money. The betrayal ran deeper than a single night. It was a lifestyle of predation enabled by a brotherhood of silence. "You and Terrence," I muttered, shaking my head. "You thought Tasha was just another trophy for the collection, but you didn't account for the woman who birthed her." I picked up a heavy glass jar from the counter. It was filled with a caustic solution used for cleaning surgical instruments, something that didn't just wash away dirt, but dissolve tissue if left too long. "Terrence is back at the cabin," I told him, watching the terror peek in his eyes. "He's tucked away in the same dark hole where you left my daughter. I wonder how long he'll last before he starts telling me the secrets you're trying so hard to hide." Malcolm's muffled protests grew frantic. I knew he was thinking about the reunion, not a family gathering of love, but a meeting of predators. I had the location now, thanks to his brother's cowardice. "I'm going to make you a deal, Malcolm," I said, leaning over him until our noses almost touched. "I'm going to leave you here with a choice. I've set a slow drip into your arm. It's a mixture of a sedative and a blood thinner. If you stay still, you might last until morning. But if you keep thrashing, if you keep trying to break those ties, well, you'll bleed out before the sun hits the cypress trees." I stood up, packing my medical bag with the same meticulous attention to detail I used when investigating a disaster in the ore. I didn't need to stay and watch. The swamp would do my work for me. "I have to go see Terrence now," I said, clicking my flashlight on. "He has a lot to answer for. And after that, I think I'll pay a visit to your father. I want to see the face of the man who raised two monsters and thought he could buy their way out of hell." I walked out the door, the screen slamming shut behind me with a finality that echoed across the water. The night was alive with the sound of insects and the distant, wet thumping of the marsh. I felt 60 years old in my bones, but in my heart, I was a force of nature. As I drove away from the lodge, I looked at the passenger seat. Tasha's jewelry sat there, reflecting the dashboard lights. I wasn't going to the police. I wasn't going to a lawyer. I was going to finish what they started. The night air outside the lodge was thick enough to choke a person, but I breathed it in like it was the first time I'd tasted oxygen in 60 years. My truck bounced over the ruts of the swamp road, the headlights cutting through the fog like a surgeon's lamp. I wasn't heading back to Savannah. I was heading to the compound. Thanks to the files I'd pulled from Malcolm's phone, I knew exactly what the Hendersons were. They weren't just a wealthy family with a spoiled son. They were an enterprise of exploitation. I saw the emails between Malcolm and his father, Julian Henderson. They didn't use words like assault or crime. They used words like incidents and disposal. They talked about my daughter like she was a faulty piece of machinery that needed to be decommissioned. I checked the GPS on the burner phone I'd taken. The Henderson estate was a fortress of old timber money, tucked behind iron gates and high stone walls. They thought their walls could keep the world out. They didn't realize that when you hurt a mother's child, you invite the devil to dinner, and I was coming with an empty stomach. I pulled over a mile from the main gate. I didn't need to ram the entrance. I knew from the messages that there was a service road used by the groundskeepers, a road that bypassed the main security cameras. As I walked through the brush, my medical bag heavy against my hip, I thought about the names I'd seen in those files. Names of girls who didn't have a Hattie Mae to come looking for them. Girls whose families had been handed a stack of hundreds to sign non-disclosure agreements that were really just receipts for their daughter's dignity. I reached the perimeter fence. It was topped with razor wire, but the Hendersons were arrogant. They relied on sensors that were 20 years old. I used a pair of heavy-duty wire cutters, the kind we used to snip through sternal wires in the ore, and made a hole just big enough for a 60-year-old woman with a grudge to slip through. The main house was a monstrosity of glass and cedar. Lights were blazing in every window. I could hear music, something classical and cold, drifting across the manicured lawn. They were having a party, a celebration. While my daughter was curled in a ball in a crawl space, the people who paid for her pain were sipping vintage wine. I moved toward the guest cottage where Terrence had said Malcolm was supposed to meet him later. I didn't want the father yet. I wanted the architect of the betrayal. I wanted Terrence to see the face of the woman he thought he'd outsmarted. I stepped onto the porch of the cottage. The door was unlocked. Inside, the air was chilled by industrial-strength AC. I saw Terrence's jacket draped over a chair. I saw a bottle of expensive scotch on the table, half empty. "Malcolm? That you?" Terrence's voice drifted from the bedroom. He sounded annoyed, not scared. "You're late. My father wants to know if the problem is handled." I didn't answer. I reached into my bag and pulled out a vial of succinylcholine, a paralytic that stops every muscle in the body except the heart. In the hospital, we use it for intubation. In this cottage, I was going to use it to ensure Terrence couldn't even blink without my permission. He walked out of the bedroom, drying his hands on a silk towel. He stopped dead when he saw me sitting in the shadows of the armchair. "Hattie? How did you get past the gate?" His voice cracked, the silk towel falling to the floor. "The gate was built to keep out people with something to lose, Terrence," I said, standing up. "I left that at the cabin with my daughter's blood." He reached for a phone on the counter, but I was faster. I didn't lunge. I threw a heavy glass decanter at his head. It clipped him, sending him reeling back against the wall. Before he could find his feet, I was on him. I didn't use a scalpel this time. I used my hands. I've spent 40 years lifting patients and standing for 12-hour shifts. My grip was like iron. I jammed the syringe into his thigh through his expensive slacks. "Wait. Hattie, please. It was Malcolm. He made me—" "Shoo," I whispered as his eyes began to glaze, the paralytic racing through his system. "Don't waste your last words on a lie. I've seen the emails, Terrence." I know you were the one who suggested the cabin. I know you were the one who told Malcolm she was ripe for the picking. He slid down the wall, his body becoming a lead weight. He was conscious, his heart racing at 200 beats a minute, but he was a statue. Now, I said, leaning in so he could see the lack of mercy in my eyes. We're going to wait for your father to finish his toast. And then we're going to show this whole family what happens when you try to bury a person. The air in the guest cottage was thick with the scent of lilies and the metallic tang of Terrence's terror. He lay paralyzed on the Persian rug, his eyes darting frantically, tracking my every movement as I prepared for the final act. I didn't need a gun. I had something far more devastating, the truth backed by the cold, hard evidence I'd harvested from Malcolm's digital life. I pulled Terrence's phone from his pocket and used his thumb to unlock it. I saw the group chat with Julian Henderson, his father, and several other men whose names commanded respect in the Georgia business world. The messages were a stomach-turning log of how they managed the brothers' appetites. They discussed my daughter's trauma like they were debating a minor zoning ordinance. You think your name is a shield, Terrence, I said, checking the time on my watch. But shields can be melted down. I left Terrence staring at the ceiling and walked toward the main house. The party was in full swing. Through the massive glass walls, I could see women in silk dresses and men in tailored suits laughing and clinking glasses. At the center of it all stood Julian Henderson, the patriarch, looking every bit the distinguished gentleman, while his sons rotted from the inside out. I walked through the service entrance, my nursing scrubs replaced by a black coat that hid my medical bag. I didn't hide in the shadows. I walked straight into the ballroom. I found the media console used for the anniversary slideshow. A young caterer was fiddling with the cables. I've got the updated tribute video from the family, I said, my voice carrying the authority of a head nurse. I handed him a thumb drive containing the terabytes of data I'd pulled. Oh, thank you, ma'am. Mr. Henderson was just asking for it, the boy said, plugging it in. I stepped back and waited. Julian Henderson took the stage, a microphone in his hand. Friends, family, he began, his voice booming with a false warmth. The Henderson name has always stood for legacy, for protection, for the future. The lights dimmed. The large projector screen flickered to life. But instead of a montage of family vacations and business awards, a jagged, raw audio file began to play. It was the voice message Tasha had left me, her screaming for her life in that cellar. The room went silent. The clink of silverware stopped. Julian turned, his face pale as he stared at the screen. Then, the images began to scroll. Not just photos of my daughter's injuries, but the emails Julian had written, the bank transfers to previous victims, the photos Malcolm had taken as trophies, the evidence of a 15-year cycle of predation and payoffs flashed before the eyes of the very people the Hendersons spent millions trying to impress. What is this? Someone shouted. Julian, what is this? I stepped into the light at the foot of the stage. It's the forensic report on your legacy, Julian, I said, my voice cutting through the rising murmurs of the crowd. Julian's eyes found mine. The gentleman vanished, replaced by a cornered animal. Security, get this woman out of here. The security is currently busy finding Terrence on the cottage floor, I said, looking around at the horrified guests. And the police are already at the gates. I didn't just bring the truth to this party, Julian. I brought the consequences. The room erupted into chaos. Some people tried to flee. Others stood frozen, watching the screen as it revealed the names of every girl the Henderson money had tried to erase. Julian lunged at me, but I didn't flinch. I had already won. I had stripped them of their only weapon, the silence. The ballroom, once a temple of timber money and high society arrogance, was now a crime scene in all but name. I stood at the edge of the stage, watching the Henderson legacy dissolve into a puddle of digital evidence and whispered accusations. Julian Henderson reached for me, his face a contorted mask of purple rage, but his own brother, a man I'd seen in the payoff records, held him back. Even the Hendersons knew when the boat was sinking. "You're a dead woman, Hattie Mae," Julian hissed, his voice trembling not with fear, but with the loss of control. "I've been dead since I heard Tasha's voice on that recording," I replied, my voice steady enough to anchor a ship. "The woman you see now is just the ghost you invited in." I didn't stay to watch the police arrive. I didn't need to see the handcuffs. I'd spent 40 years as a surgical nurse. I knew when the tumor had been removed. I walked back toward the guest cottage, the cool night air hitting my face like a benediction. Inside, Terrence was exactly where I'd left him. His eyes were wide, tracking me as I walked over and sat in the chair across from him. The paralytic was beginning to wear off. I dosed him just enough to keep him still for the revelation. His fingers twitched against the rug. My father, Terrence slurred, his tongue still heavy. "Your father is currently busy explaining 15 years of conspiracy to a room full of people who are already tweeting your family's secrets to the world," I said. "And Malcolm? He's currently a guest of the Georgia Marsh. I told him if he stayed still, he might live, but we both know Malcolm isn't good at following rules." I leaned forward, my face inches from his. "Tasha is going to wake up in a world where you don't exist, where your name is a curse, where your brother is a memory of a monster that got caught. That is the only settlement you're ever going to pay." I reached into my bag one last time. I didn't pull out a syringe. I pulled out Tasha's necklace, the one Malcolm had taken as a souvenir. I dropped it onto Terrence's chest. "You thought she was a trophy," I whispered, "but she's a Pearson. And you're just the man who forgot that the most dangerous thing in the woods isn't the wolf. It's the mother of the cub the wolf tried to take." I walked out of the cottage and toward my truck. My phone buzzed. It was a text from the private nurse I'd hired to watch the cabin where I'd hidden Tasha. "She's awake. She asked for you." The drive back to the cabin felt shorter than the drive to the compound. The rage that had been keeping me upright for the last 48 hours began to subside, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion. But as I pulled up to the small house and saw the light in the window, I felt a spark of something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope wasn't a feeling. It was a survival tactic. I walked into the kitchen, the floorboards still bearing the scars of the struggle. I pushed aside the heavy furniture and opened the crawl space. Tasha wasn't there. The nurse had moved her to the bed in the back room. I walked in, and Tasha turned her head. Her eyes were no longer vacant. They were filled with tears, but they were her eyes. "Mama," she whispered. "I'm here, baby," I said, sitting on the edge of the bed and taking her hand. "The monsters are gone. I made sure of it." The morning sun didn't just rise over the Savannah River. It felt like a spotlight on a world that had finally been scrubbed clean. I sat on the porch of our family home, watching Tasha sleep through the screen door. For the first time in weeks, her breathing wasn't hitched with terror. The Hendersons had tried to bury her in the dark, but they forgot that a Pearson is like a seed. The deeper you try to hide us, the stronger we grow toward the light. The news didn't carry the names of the mysterious benefactor who provided the evidence, and that's just how I wanted it. I didn't need a headline. I had the sound of Malcolm's voice begging for a mercy he never gave, and the sight of Julian Henderson's pride crumbling like dry rot. The reunion had turned into a mass indictment. Terrence, Malcolm, and Julian were now facing a reality that no amount of timber money could fix. In my world, a surgical strike is always more effective than a messy battle. I had removed the cancer without killing the patient. My daughter was alive, and the predators were neutralized. "Mama," Tasha's voice drifted out, stronger today. I'm right here, baby. I called back. I walked inside and handed her a cup of tea. We didn't talk about the cabin. We didn't talk about the syringes or the swamp. We talked about the garden we were going to plant in the spring, peppers, okra, and roses. Life was moving forward. And for the first time in 60 years, I realized that vengeance isn't about the fire you start. It's about the peace you protect once the smoke clears. The Henderson name was now synonymous with the very rot they tried to hide, and Tasha Pearson was synonymous with the one thing they couldn't break: survival. They say the arc of the moral universe is long, but sometimes it needs a 60-year-old nurse with a medical bag to bend it toward justice. The Hendersons thought they were the masters of the marsh, but they learned the hard way that a mother's love is the most calculated, aggressive, and unrelenting force on this green earth. If you ever find yourself in the dark, remember, the monsters are only scary until they meet someone who isn't afraid to take them apart piece by piece. If this story of surgical retribution gripped you, don't just walk away. Smash that like button and subscribe to Vintage Vengeance. We don't do courtrooms here. We do results. Drop a comment below with the word survivor if you believe a mother's fury knows no bounds. Click the video on your screen right now to see our next deep dive into the shadows where justice is served cold and sharp. I'm Hattie May, and remember, never mistake silence for weakness. See you in the next one.